The branch snapped under her foot, and Elena froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. Behind her, somewhere in the black trees, something large moved through the undergrowth, and the sound of its breathing was too heavy, too deliberate, to belong to any ordinary animal. She had been running for almost an hour, her lungs burning, her legs shaking, and she still did not know if she was closer to safety or further from it. She had left the city 3 days ago, with nothing but a bag of clothes and a folded letter that promised her a job as a translator in a quiet northern town. The letter had lied. There was no town, there was no job, there was only a dark forest, a car that broke down on an empty road, and 2 men who had followed her from the moment she stepped off the bus. She had escaped them by running into the trees, and now she was lost in a place she did not understand, hunted by something she understood even less. A twig cracked again, closer this time, and Elena pressed herself against the trunk of an old oak, her hand covering her mouth to keep her breathing quiet. Moonlight slipped through the leaves in thin silver threads, and for a moment she saw it, a shape, low and powerful, moving between the trees with a grace that no human body could manage. Its eyes caught the light and glowed pale gold, and Elena's entire body went cold. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in this region had, stories of a kingdom hidden deep in the northern woods, ruled by people who were not entirely people, who changed shape under the moon, and lived by laws no outsider was meant to know. She had always thought they were just stories. The kind parents used to keep children from wandering too far from home. Now, with golden eyes watching her from the darkness, she understood that stories were sometimes true. The creature took a step closer, and Elena's foot slid on wet leaves. She stumbled, caught herself on a low branch, and in that single moment of noise, the creature moved. It did not attack. Instead, it let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a warning, and the ground began to shake with the approach of many feet. Men appeared from the trees, tall and broad, their eyes carrying that same strange gold light, though in human form it was easier to hide. They surrounded her without a word, closing the space between the trees until there was nowhere left to run. Elena's back hit the oak trunk, and she slid down until she was sitting, her arms wrapped around her knees, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. One of them spoke, a low command in a language she did not recognize, and the group parted to let someone through. He walked differently than the others, with the kind of stillness that came from absolute authority, not needing to prove anything to anyone. He was tall, his shoulders set with quiet control, his dark hair damp from the night mist, but it was his eyes that held her still. They were gold, like the others, but sharper somehow, older, carrying a weight that made the air around him feel heavier. He crouched in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, close enough to smell rain and pine on his skin. He studied her the way a man might study a locked door, trying to work out what was behind it before deciding whether to open it. "You are far from anywhere a human should be," he said. His voice was low, controlled, giving away nothing. Elena's throat was too dry to answer immediately. She swallowed, tried to steady her voice, and finally managed, "I didn't choose to come here. I got lost." "People do not simply get lost in Blackthorn territory," he said. "The forest does not let them wander this deep by accident." "Then the forest made a mistake," she said, surprising herself with how sharp the words came out, fear turning into something closer to defiance. Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite amusement, but close to it. He rose to his feet and turned to the man beside him, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar along his brow. "Bring her to the hall. Do not let anyone touch her." "Alpha, we don't know who sent her," the scarred man said quietly. "She could be a scout. Corwin's people have tried worse tricks. If she were a scout, she would have run toward the border, not away from it," the Alpha said. "She ran from something. I want to know what." Elena's mind spun. Alpha. The word rang with an authority she had only heard in old folk tales, stories her grandmother used to tell about kings who ruled not through crowns but through blood and instinct, kings who could command an entire pack with a single look. She studied him now, this man who had appeared out of nowhere and silenced a group of dangerous strangers with barely a sentence, and she understood, with a mixture of fear and reluctant awe, that she was looking at exactly that kind of king. He extended a hand to help her up, and after a long hesitation, she took it. His grip was warm, steady, and far gentler than she expected from someone who commanded so much power. He did not let go until she was fully standing, and even then, his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to solve something that did not add up. They walked through the forest in silence, the pack moving around them like a living wall, protecting her without a single word of explanation. Elena kept glancing at the alpha beside her, trying to understand why a man who looked at her like she was a puzzle would also walk close enough that his shoulder occasionally brushed hers, as if some part of him did not want her too far away. The trees eventually thinned, and Elena's breath caught at the sight ahead of her. A castle rose from the base of a mountain, its stone walls dark and ancient, torches flickering along its length like a string of golden eyes. It did not look like something from this century, yet the closer they came, the more she noticed small details that betrayed a quiet, careful modern life, hidden behind the ancient stone. Soft light, behind glass windows, the shape of a car, parked near a side entrance, the hum of something electrical, deep within the walls. "Welcome to Blackthorn Hall," the Alpha said, his tone unreadable. "You will stay here until we understand why you were running through my territory in the middle of the night." "And if I don't want to stay?" Elena asked, immediately regretting the challenge in her voice. He turned to look at her fully then, and for the first time she saw something other than calculation in his gaze, something almost like concern, quickly hidden beneath his composed exterior. "Then you would be walking straight back into whatever it was that made you run in the first place. I do not think you want that." She had no answer for that, because he was right. Whatever waited for her outside these woods was worse than whatever waited inside them, at least for now. They passed through the enormous doors of the hall, and Elena felt the weight of every eye that turned to watch her. Pack members lined the halls, whispering to each other in tones too quiet to catch, their curious glances following her like a current. She kept her chin high despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body, refusing to let herself appear as fragile as she felt. The Alpha led her to a smaller chamber, near the back of the hall, a room with a fireplace already lit, a bed made with soft linens, and a window that looked out over the dark tree line she had just escaped. "You will be safe here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we will speak properly. My name is Kale." "Elena," she said quietly, testing the sound of her own name in this strange new place. He nodded once, as if committing it to memory, and turned to leave. At the door he paused, his hand resting against the frame, and for a moment Elena thought he might say something else. Instead, he simply said, "Rest, Elena. No harm will come to you here," before disappearing into the corridor, leaving her alone with the crackle of the fire and the pounding of her own uncertain heart. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she allowed herself to lie down, staring at the stone ceiling above her, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Just hours ago she had been a woman with an ordinary, unremarkable life, chasing a job that never existed. Now she was inside the walls of a kingdom, ruled by a man who could command a pack of wolves with the sound of his voice, a man whose gold eyes had looked at her like she was something worth protecting, though she could not begin to understand why. Sleep came slowly, pulled under by exhaustion despite the fear still humming beneath her skin. And just as her mind began to drift, she thought she heard something strange, a voice, low and rough, echoing faintly at the very edge of her hearing, though there was no one else in the room. She was too tired to question it, too tired to realize that this faint, impossible whisper was the very first thread of a secret that would change everything. Morning came with pale light slipping through the narrow window, and Elena woke slowly, momentarily forgetting where she was, until the unfamiliar stone ceiling reminded her. She sat up, rubbing the last traces of sleep from her eyes, and noticed a folded set of clothes placed neatly on a chair near the door, along with a tray of food that smelled far better than anything she expected to find in a place like this. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and a young woman entered before Elena could respond, carrying a jug of water and an expression of open curiosity. She had warm brown eyes and dark curls pulled back loosely, and she smiled at Elena like they were already friends rather than strangers meeting under strange circumstances. "I'm Lyra," the young woman said, setting the jug down. "I was told to help you settle in. You gave the whole hall something to talk about last night, you know, a human girl, walking straight into Kale's path like that." "I didn't walk into anything," Elena said, still half convinced this was some elaborate dream. I was running from something else entirely. Lyra's smile faltered slightly, curiosity shifting into concern. Whatever you were running from, you're safe now. Kale doesn't bring outsiders into the hall unless he intends to protect them. That's rare. More rare than you probably realize. Elena studied her for a moment, trying to gauge how much she could trust this stranger, with warm eyes and easy words. Is he always like that? Cold, but not quite? Lyra laughed softly. Kale has been alpha since he was young, forced to grow into the role faster than anyone should. He doesn't let his guard down, not with the pack, not with visitors, not really with anyone. So whatever it is he's doing with you, trust me, it's different. Before Elena could ask what she meant by that, Lyra was already moving toward the door, promising to return once Elena had eaten and dressed. Left alone again, Elena picked at the food, her mind circling back to the strange, faint whisper she thought she had heard the night before, and to the way Kale's gold eyes had lingered on her like she was something he could not quite explain. She did not yet know that somewhere else in the castle, in a private study lined with old books and dim candlelight, Kale sat with his forehead resting against his palm, listening to a voice inside his own mind that would not stop talking about her, a voice that belonged to something far older and far more honest than the composed king he presented to the world. 3 days passed before Elena was allowed to leave the small chamber on her own, and in that time she learned the shape of her new world through the people who visited her. Lyra came each morning with food and quiet conversation, slowly filling in the gaps of a history Elena had never known existed. She learned that Blackthorn Hall sat at the heart of a territory ruled by Kale, and that the pack lived by codes older than any human government, codes built on loyalty, protection, and the uneasy balance between man and wolf. She also learned, though no one said it outright, that something had shifted in the hall since her arrival. Pack members who passed her in the corridor watched her with open curiosity, some with suspicion, a few with something closer to wariness, as if they could smell a change in the air that Elena herself could not yet name. On the 4th morning, Kale sent word that she was to join him in the study for a conversation about her situation, and Elena walked the long stone corridor toward his chambers with her nerves twisting into knots. The door was open when she arrived, and she paused in the frame, watching him for a moment before he noticed her. He stood near a tall window, a book open in one hand, though his eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the glass, unfocused, distant. There was a stillness to him that felt different from the composed authority she had seen in the forest, something almost vulnerable in the way his shoulders held tension without releasing it. "You can come in," he said, without turning, and Elena startled slightly, wondering how he had known she was there. She stepped inside, taking the seat he gestured toward, and waited as he closed the book and set it aside. "I have spoken with my trackers," he said. "They found the car you mentioned, abandoned exactly where you said it would be. They also found signs that 2 men had been following your trail before you entered the forest." Elena's stomach tightened. "Did they find them?" "No," Kale said. "Whoever they were, they turned back at the border. Smart or frightened? Possibly both." He studied her carefully. "You said you thought you were traveling for work. A translator position, somewhere in the north." "That's what the letter said," Elena replied. "There was no job. I understand that now. Someone wanted you drawn into this territory," Kale said, his voice low, calculating. "The question is why?" Elena had no answer for that, and the silence between them stretched long enough that she began to feel the weight of his gaze on her, the way it had felt in the forest, like he was trying to read something written beneath her skin. She shifted in her seat, and to fill the silence, she asked the first real question that came to mind. "Why did you help me? Your men could have easily turned me away, or worse. Instead, you brought me into your own home." Kale's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment Elena thought he would deflect the question entirely. "Instead," he said, "alphas are meant to protect what enters their territory, human or otherwise. It was the only reasonable choice." It was a careful answer, practiced, the kind of thing a king would say to maintain distance. But something in his tone did not quite match his words, a faint crack in the otherwise perfect composure, and Elena found herself wondering what he was not saying. Their conversation ended not long after, with Kale promising to keep her updated on any further developments, and Elena returning to her chamber with more questions than answers. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered the quiet halls, careful to stay close to the corridors Lyra had shown her. until she found herself near the edge of the private study, where she had spoken to Cale earlier that day. The door was slightly open, a soft golden light spilling into the hallway, and Elena slowed her steps, intending to turn back before she disturbed him. But as she paused near the doorway, a voice drifted out, low, rough, layered with something that did not quite sound human, though it was undeniably Cale's voice shaping the words. "She is not afraid of me," the voice said, quiet, almost to itself. "Everyone else in this hall fears what we are, yet she looked at me like I was simply a man standing in her way." Elena froze, her breath catching in her throat, certain she had misheard, certain the voice belonged to someone else entirely. But there was no one else in the room. Through the narrow gap in the door, she could see Cale standing alone near the window, his lips barely moving, his eyes distant, as if he were listening to something rather than speaking it. "You noticed the same thing," he murmured, and this time his voice shifted subtly, deepening, roughening at the edges, though it remained undeniably his own. The way her scent changed when she looked at me. Not fear, curiosity, perhaps something else. Elena's mind spun in confusion. He was talking to himself, or perhaps talking to someone she could not see, and the words themselves made no sense unless she allowed herself to consider something impossible, that she was hearing two voices from one mouth, a man, and something else entirely, something that lived inside him and spoke with its own will. "She does not belong to Corwin's schemes," the second voice continued, softer now, almost affectionate in its tone. "I do not care what brought her here. I only care that she stays within these walls, where nothing can reach her." Elena's pulse hammered so loudly she was certain it would give her away. She took a careful step back from the door, and in doing so, her foot caught the edge of a loose stone, sending a soft scrape echoing down the corridor. She froze completely, certain she had been discovered, but after a long moment of silence, she heard Cale's voice again, this time clearly directed at the door. "Is someone there?" Her heart lurched, and she forced herself to step into the doorway rather than flee, knowing that running would only raise more suspicion. "It's just me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I couldn't sleep. I didn't mean to disturb you." Cale studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, though something flickered behind his eyes, quick and controlled, like a door slamming shut on whatever had just been happening in that room. "You should be resting," he said finally, his tone returning to its usual careful distance. "The nights here are not always safe for wandering." "I understand," Elena said, though her mind was still racing with what she had just heard. "I'll go back." She turned and walked quickly down the corridor, not daring to look back, her thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and disbelief. By the time she reached her chamber, she was breathless, sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands pressed against her temples, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had heard two voices, one belonging to Cale, calm and measured, the voice she had come to associate with his careful control. The other rougher, deeper, more raw, speaking with an honesty that Cale himself clearly did not allow into his own words. And somehow, impossibly, both voices had been speaking about her. Sleep did not come easily that night, her mind circling endlessly around the strange conversation she had overheard, wondering if she had imagined the entire thing out of exhaustion and fear. But deep down, she knew what she had heard was real, and more than that, she knew it should not have been possible for her to hear it at all. The following days passed with a strange, careful tension between them. Cale remained as composed as ever during their brief conversations, discussing security arrangements and the ongoing search for whoever had sent her into his territory. But now, whenever their eyes met, Elena found herself searching for traces of that second voice, wondering if it still lingered somewhere beneath his controlled exterior, wondering if it was still speaking about her in ways he would never allow himself to say aloud. She did not tell anyone what she had heard, not even Lyra, whose easy friendship had become one of the few comforts in this strange new life. Some instinct told her that revealing what she could hear would change everything, perhaps even endanger her, in ways she did not yet understand. So she kept the secret close, carrying it quietly through her days, watching Cale with new eyes, listening for the moments when his careful mask might slip again. It happened again nearly a week later, in the quiet hours before dawn, when Elena woke suddenly from a restless sleep and found herself unable to fall back into it. She walked to the window of her chamber, watching the pale light begin to touch the treetops, and as she stood there, she heard it again, faint but unmistakable. drifting through the walls as though carried on some current she alone could sense. She is stronger than she realizes, the rough voice murmured, somewhere far beyond her own room, somewhere she should not have been able to hear at all. I want to see what she becomes, once she stops being afraid. Elena pressed her hand against the cool stone of the window, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else entirely, something warmer, something she did not yet have the courage to name. Whatever this strange connection was, whatever allowed her to hear the private thoughts of a king who guarded his heart so carefully, she understood now that it was not going to fade quietly into the background. It was only the beginning of something far larger, something that would tie her fate to Cale's, in ways neither of them could yet imagine. A sharp cry cut through the training yard before dawn, jolting Elena out of sleep with her heart already racing. She sat upright, listening as footsteps thundered past her door, voices shouting commands in tones far too urgent for an ordinary morning. She pulled a robe over her shoulders and cracked the door open just enough to see pack members rushing toward the outer walls, faces set with alarm. Lyra appeared moments later, breathless, her usual warmth replaced with tight concern. "Stay inside," she said quickly. "Someone tried to cross the border during the night. Cale's people caught them before they got far, but it has everyone on edge." "Who was it?" Elena asked, her pulse still hammering. "We don't know yet," Lyra admitted. "But it's the second attempt this month. Corwin's pack has been testing our borders for weeks, probing for weaknesses. Cale thinks they're searching for something, or someone." Elena's stomach twisted at the implication, wondering if she herself might be the reason for the sudden aggression, though she said nothing, unwilling to voice a fear she could not yet confirm. Lyra left soon after, promising to return once things settled, and Elena spent the rest of the morning pacing her small chamber, straining to catch any fragment of information drifting through the halls. It was near midday, when a firm knock interrupted her restless thoughts, and Dorian, the broad-shouldered man with the scarred brow she remembered from her first night in the forest, stepped into the room, without waiting for an invitation. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes carried a wariness that had not been there before. "Cale wants to speak with you," he said simply, "now." Elena followed him through corridors buzzing with tense energy, pack members exchanging hushed words as they passed, until they reached the same study where she had overheard that impossible conversation days earlier. Cale stood near his desk this time, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. "One of the intruders was carrying this," he said, holding up a small folded paper before setting it down in front of her. Elena stepped closer, her breath catching, as she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was identical to the letter that had lured her into this territory in the first place. "That's the same writing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The letter that told me about the translator job. This is the same person." "So it seems," Cale said, his tone carefully controlled, though tension radiated from every line of his posture. "Which means, whoever sent you into my territory is still watching, still trying to reach you, or perhaps, trying to reach something through you." "I don't understand what they want from me," Elena said, frustration bleeding into her voice. "I'm no one important. I had an ordinary life before all of this." Cale studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his gold eyes. "Perhaps you were ordinary," he said quietly, "but you are not ordinary any longer, not since you stepped into these woods." The weight of his words settled over her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence thick with unspoken questions. Dorian shifted near the doorway, clearing his throat. "Alpha, the council is waiting. We need to discuss increasing patrols before nightfall." Cale nodded once, though his eyes lingered on Elena a moment longer before he finally turned to leave. "Stay close to the hall today," he told her. "I will have someone bring your meals directly to your chamber until we understand the full scope of this threat." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle whatever danger might be circling closer, but something in his tone told her this was not a request she was meant to refuse. She nodded instead, watching him leave with Dorian close behind, the door closing softly behind them. Alone again, Elena sat by the window, watching pack members move across the training yard below, their formations sharp and disciplined despite the tension humming through the entire hall. She thought about the letter, about the handwriting that connected her old, ordinary life to this strange new danger, and a cold unease settled deep in her chest. Evening arrived heavy with unspoken worry, and Elena found herself unable to eat the meal left outside her door. her appetite lost beneath the weight of uncertainty. She paced her small chamber until exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, though even then, her rest remained shallow, broken by half-formed dreams of golden eyes watching her from the darkness. She woke sometime past midnight to the quiet murmur of voices drifting from somewhere beyond her walls, faint but unmistakable, carried on that same strange current she had first noticed weeks earlier. She sat up slowly, straining to listen, and this time the voice was clearer than it had ever been before, close enough that she wondered if Cale stood just outside her door. "She does not know how close the danger truly is," the rougher voice murmured, laced with something that sounded almost like fear, an emotion Elena never expected to associate with a king so composed. "If Corwin's people reach her before we understand what she means to this, we may lose more than territory. She is not a piece on a board," Cale's own voice responded, firmer, though carrying the same undertone of worry. "Whatever she means to Corwin, whatever brought her here, she is under my protection now. That will not change." "You speak of protection," the rough voice said, quieter now, almost teasing despite the tension threading through its words. "Yet you have not told her the truth about why your heart beats faster whenever she is near. Perhaps it is time you did." Elena's breath caught sharply in her throat, her entire body going still as she absorbed the meaning behind those words. She pressed her palm flat against the cool stone wall, steadying herself against a wave of disbelief, and something warmer, something she still refused to name. "This is not the time for such conversations," Cale said, his voice tightening, though there was no real denial in his words, only avoidance. "We have larger concerns than my own feelings. Feelings that are becoming harder to ignore." The rough voice pressed gently. "I have watched you rule this pack for years, without hesitation, without softness. Yet one human woman walks into our forest, and suddenly, you are a man torn between duty and something far more complicated." Silence followed, long enough that Elena wondered if the conversation had ended entirely. She remained frozen by the wall, hardly daring to breathe, until finally Cale's voice returned, quieter now, almost resigned. "I know what I feel," he admitted softly. "I simply do not yet know what to do with it." Elena's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain the sound alone might betray her position, though no footsteps approached her door, no sign that anyone suspected she had overheard something never meant for her ears. She stepped back from the wall slowly, retreating to her bed, sitting in the darkness with her thoughts racing far too quickly to allow any hope of sleep. She understood now, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that this pull she felt toward Cale was not entirely one-sided, that beneath his composed exterior lived something honest and unguarded, something that spoke freely about feelings Cale himself refused to voice. The wolf inside him, whatever strange and ancient part of his nature it represented, clearly saw her as something worth protecting, something worth caring for, beyond simple duty. But with that understanding came new fear, sharper and more immediate than before. If Corwin's people were truly searching for her, if the danger circling this territory was tied somehow to her own unexplained arrival, then whatever connection was forming between herself and Cale might become more than just a secret worth keeping. It might become a vulnerability that put them both at far greater risk than either of them yet realized. Elena lay awake long into the night, staring at the stone ceiling above her, torn between the warmth blooming quietly in her chest and the cold unease that had settled there just as firmly. Whatever this strange bond was between herself and the Alpha King, whatever secret whispered thoughts she was somehow able to hear, she understood now that ignoring it was no longer an option. The wolf had spoken first, honest and unguarded, and Elena knew that sooner or later, she would have to decide what to do with the truth she now carried. A sudden crash echoed from the training yard, followed by shouts sharp enough to pull Elena from her chamber before she had even finished dressing. She rushed to the window, her breath catching at the sight below. Two pack members grappling fiercely, one thrown hard against the stone wall, while others circled, unsure whether to intervene. Cale arrived within seconds, his voice cutting through the chaos with a single command that silenced the entire yard instantly. Elena watched from above as he separated the two men with barely any effort, his presence alone enough to end a fight that moments earlier had looked ready to spiral into something far worse. She admired the control he carried, the way authority radiated from him without a single raised hand, though she also noticed something else now. something she could not unsee since the night she had overheard his private thoughts. Beneath that composed exterior lived a man far more complicated than the mask he wore for his pack. She was still watching when Lyra knocked and stepped inside, breathless from climbing the stairs quickly. "Territorial dispute," Lyra explained, noticing Elena's attention on the yard below. "Happens sometimes when tension runs high across the pack. Everyone's on edge because of the border attacks." "Is it always like this?" Elena asked, turning away from the window. "Not usually this frequent," Lyra admitted. "But ever since you arrived, things have felt different. Not because of you," she added quickly, seeing Elena's expression shift, "but because Kale has been distracted. Distracted in a way none of us have seen before." Elena's chest tightened at the observation, though she forced her expression to remain neutral, unwilling to reveal just how much she already understood about the reason behind that distraction. "I'm sure he has plenty to think about, with the border threats and everything else." Lyra studied her for a moment longer than necessary, something knowing flickering behind her warm brown eyes, though she said nothing further on the matter, simply gesturing for Elena to follow her down toward the main hall for the midday meal. The hall was filled with quiet conversation when they arrived. Pack members gathered around long wooden tables, their voices lowering slightly as Elena took her seat near the far end. She had grown used to the curious glances by now, though today she noticed an added edge of wariness in some expressions, a result, she suspected, of the growing tension along the border. Kale entered partway through the meal, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere of the room, conversations quieting into a respectful hush before slowly resuming. He took his usual place at the head table, though his eyes found Elena's briefly before he looked away, a subtle acknowledgement that no one else in the hall seemed to notice. Elena forced herself to focus on her meal, though her mind circled endlessly around the words she had overheard the previous night, words that painted an entirely different picture of the composed king sitting just across the hall. She wondered how she was supposed to sit through an ordinary meal now, knowing what she knew, pretending that nothing had changed between them when everything, in truth, felt entirely different. After the meal, Dorian approached her table, his expression carrying the same careful neutrality she had come to expect from him. "Kale would like you to join him for a walk through the eastern gardens," he said. "He believes fresh air might do you good, given how confined you have been these past days." Elena agreed, though her pulse quickened at the thought of spending time alone with Kale, knowing now what secret feelings lived beneath his controlled exterior. She followed Dorian through the hall and out toward the gardens, where Kale waited near a stone archway, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. They walked in silence at first, the eastern gardens stretching wide and green beneath the afternoon sun, filled with flowering shrubs and carefully maintained paths that wound between ancient stone statues. Elena found herself stealing glances at Kale as they walked, searching for any outward sign of the emotions his wolf had spoken so openly about, though his composed expression revealed nothing. "You seem quieter than usual today," Kale observed after several minutes of silence, his gold eyes studying her carefully. "I suppose I have a lot on my mind," Elena admitted, choosing her words carefully. "The attacks, the letter, all of it. It's difficult not to feel unsettled." "That is understandable," Kale said, his tone gentler than she expected. "You have been thrown into a world you never asked to be part of. I imagine it would unsettle anyone." Elena studied him for a moment, weighing whether to press further into the strange pull she felt growing between them, though something held her back, an instinct telling her the truth was not yet hers to reveal. "Can I ask you something?" she said instead. "Of course. Do you always keep everyone at such a distance, even your own pack?" Kale's expression shifted slightly, something guarded flickering behind his eyes before he answered. "An alpha cannot afford weakness. Distance keeps decisions clear, keeps emotions from clouding judgment when lives depend on those decisions." "That sounds lonely," Elena said softly, surprising herself with the honesty of the observation. Something in Kale's expression cracked slightly at her words. A brief flash of vulnerability quickly smoothed back into composure. "Perhaps it is," he admitted quietly, "though I have never allowed myself the luxury of dwelling on that." They continued walking, the conversation drifting into safer territory, discussions of the garden's history, the various plants cultivated there for medicinal purposes, the quiet traditions of the pack that Elena found herself genuinely curious about. Yet beneath the surface of their easy conversation, she remained acutely aware of every small gesture, every lingering glance, searching for confirmation of the feelings she now knew existed within him. As they neared the end of the garden path, a sudden commotion interrupted their quiet walk, one of the younger pack members rushing toward them with clear urgency written across his face. Alpha. Riders were spotted near the northern ridge, Corwin's colors. Kale's entire demeanor shifted instantly, the gentle warmth from moments earlier, replaced by sharp, focused authority. How many? At least a dozen, moving fast toward the border. Sound the alert, Kale commanded. I want the northern patrol doubled immediately. He turned to Elena, his expression tightening with concern. You need to return to the hall, now. Elena nodded, though fear coiled tightly in her stomach as she followed him back through the garden at a hurried pace, pack members already mobilizing around them with practiced efficiency. Whatever calm had settled over the afternoon shattered entirely, replaced by the sharp, urgent energy of a territory bracing for potential conflict. By the time they reached the hall, the entire castle buzzed with activity. Warriors gathering weapons, scouts receiving orders, the air thick with tension that mirrored the uncertainty Elena still carried about her own role in this unfolding danger. Kale left her at the entrance to her chamber, with a final instruction to stay inside, no matter what she heard, before disappearing down the corridor toward the war room, with Dorian close behind. Alone once more, Elena paced the small space of her chamber, her mind racing between fear for Kale's safety and the strange, growing tenderness she could not quite suppress whenever she thought of him. She understood now that pretending she knew nothing about his private feelings would only become more difficult as the danger around them intensified, as their lives became more tightly woven together with each passing threat. Night fell heavy with uncertainty, distant shouts occasionally drifting from the outer walls as patrols moved through the darkness. Elena sat by her window long after the last traces of sunlight faded, watching torchlight flicker along the battlements, wondering how much longer she could carry this secret before it demanded to be spoken aloud. The sound of returning riders reached Elena's chamber just before dawn, hooves and boots clattering against stone as pack members flooded back into the courtyard below. She rushed to the window, scanning the tired, dust-covered figures for any sign of Kale, her chest tightening with worry, until she finally spotted him near the front of the group, walking under his own strength, though favoring one side slightly. She did not wait for permission before hurrying down the stairs, weaving through the crowded courtyard until she reached him, ignoring the surprised glances from pack members who clearly did not expect a human guest to push her way toward their injured king. Kale's eyes widened slightly when he saw her, though exhaustion dulled the sharpness of his usual composure. You should not be out here, he said, though there was little force behind the words. You're hurt, Elena said, ignoring his protest entirely, her eyes fixed on the dark stains spreading across the side of his shirt. It is nothing serious, Kale replied, though the tightness in his jaw suggested otherwise. Corwin's people retreated once they realized we outnumbered them, but not before a few blades found their mark. Dorian appeared beside them, his own face marked with a fresh bruise along his cheekbone. The healer is preparing the medical chamber, Alpha. You should let her look at that wound properly this time, rather than dismissing it like you usually do. Kale waved off the suggestion with visible reluctance, though Elena stepped closer, her voice firm despite the uncertainty still swirling inside her. Let them help you, please. Something in her tone seemed to reach him in a way Dorian's insistence had not, and after a long pause, Kale nodded once, allowing himself to be guided toward the medical chamber with visible effort. Elena followed without being asked, ignoring the questioning looks from pack members along the way, determined to see for herself that his injuries were not as serious as her fear insisted they might be. The medical chamber smelled of herbs and clean linen, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, already preparing bandages and salves by the time they arrived. She examined Kale's wound with practiced efficiency, murmuring quiet instructions as she cleaned and stitched the gash along his ribs, Kale enduring the process with barely a flinch, his eyes occasionally drifting toward Elena, who remained near the doorway, unwilling to leave despite having no real reason to stay. You did not need to come, Kale said once the healer stepped away to gather more supplies, his voice quieter now, stripped of its usual authority. I wanted to, Elena admitted simply. I was worried. Something shifted behind his gold eyes at her words, a flicker of surprise quickly softening into something gentler. You barely know me, he said, though the observation carried curiosity rather than dismissal. "I know enough to understand. You nearly gave your life protecting this territory today," Elena said. "That matters to me, whether I've known you 3 weeks or 3 years." Kale studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed willing to name aloud. The healer returned before either of them could break the silence, finishing the bandaging with quick, practiced hands before insisting Kale rest for the remainder of the day. Elena remained by his side even after the healer departed, settling into a chair near the window, while Kale reclined against the pillows, his usual sharp alertness dulled by exhaustion and lingering pain. They talked quietly for a while, conversation drifting between lighter topics, childhood memories, small observations about pack life that Kale shared more freely than she expected, given how guarded he usually kept himself. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him toward sleep, his breathing evening out as his eyes finally closed, and Elena remained seated nearby, unwilling to leave him alone so soon after the danger he had faced. It was in that quiet stillness, with only the soft crackle of the fireplace filling the room, that she heard it again, faint but unmistakable, drifting from Kale even as he slept. "She stayed," the rough voice murmured, low and drowsy, carrying a warmth Elena had never heard from him while fully awake. "Even wounded, even with danger still circling these walls, she stayed by my side." "She did," Kale's own voice answered softly, equally drowsy, the careful control of his waking hours entirely absent now. "I do not deserve such loyalty from someone who owes me nothing." "Perhaps loyalty is not the right word," the rough voice replied gently. "Perhaps she stays, because some part of her feels the same pull we do, even if she does not yet understand it." Elena's breath caught, her heart hammering loudly enough that she feared it might wake him, though Kale's breathing remained steady, undisturbed, lost somewhere between sleep and whatever strange internal conversation his wolf carried on without his full awareness. She sat frozen in her chair, torn between the instinct to flee before she overheard something too private, and the undeniable pull keeping her rooted exactly where she was. "I want to tell her," Kale's voice continued quietly, threaded with something almost like longing. "I want to tell her what she means to us, what we felt the moment she looked at us without fear in that forest. But how do I explain something I barely understand myself?" "You do not need to understand it fully," the rough voice answered. "You only need to be honest. She deserves that much, especially now that danger circles closer with every passing day." Silence followed, Kale's breathing deepening further into true sleep, the strange conversation fading into stillness. Elena remained seated for a long while afterward, her mind spinning with everything she had just heard, the warmth blooming in her chest, impossible to ignore any longer. She rose quietly eventually, careful not to disturb him, and made her way back toward her own chamber, through corridors now quiet with the exhaustion of the previous night's conflict. Lyra found her along the way, her expression softening with understanding, rather than curiosity this time. "You care for him," Lyra said simply, not quite a question. Elena hesitated, unsure how much to admit, even to someone she had come to trust. "I don't know what I feel," she said honestly. "Everything is happening so quickly, and there's still so much I don't understand about this place, about him." "Sometimes understanding comes slower than feeling," Lyra said gently. "That doesn't make the feeling any less real." Elena thought about those words long after Lyra left her at her chamber door, replaying the quiet, drowsy honesty she had overheard from Kale, the vulnerability so different from the composed king he presented to his pack. She understood now, more clearly than ever, that cracks were forming in the careful walls he had built around himself, cracks that had begun the very moment she stepped into his forest weeks ago. Whatever this connection between them truly was, whatever strange ability allowed her to hear thoughts never meant to reach her ears, Elena knew now that ignoring the growing warmth between them was no longer something either of them could sustain for much longer. The Ice King's walls were cracking, slowly but surely, and Elena found herself both terrified and quietly hopeful about what might emerge once those walls finally came down completely. Glass shattered somewhere below Elena's window, the sound sharp and violent enough to jolt her upright in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs before her mind even fully registered what had happened. She scrambled out of bed, pressing herself against the wall beside the window, straining to hear past the sudden shouting that erupted through the courtyard below. Fire. She could see it now, flickering orange light reflecting off the stone walls, smoke curling upward from somewhere near the eastern storage buildings. Pack members rushed past each other in organized chaos, some carrying buckets of water, others already armed and moving toward the outer walls with grim determination. Her door burst open without warning, and Dorian filled the frame, his expression tighter than she had ever seen it. "Corwin's people breached the eastern wall," he said quickly. "This was a distraction. Kale thinks they're after you." Elena's blood ran cold. "Me? Why would they want me?" "We don't have time to explain," Dorian said, already pulling her toward the door. "Kale ordered you move to the safe chamber beneath the hall. Now." She followed him without argument, her bare feet slapping against cold stone as they hurried through corridors filled with shouting and the acrid smell of smoke. They had barely reached the base of the stairs when a group of unfamiliar men rounded the corner ahead, their eyes carrying none of the golden warmth she had grown used to among Kale's pack, but something colder, sharper, hungrier. "There," one of them snarled, and Dorian shoved Elena behind him just as the group surged forward. The fight that followed happened too fast for Elena to fully process. Dorian moving with brutal efficiency against two attackers at once, his years of training evident in every controlled strike. She pressed herself against the wall, searching desperately for any escape route, when a third man broke away from the fight and lunged directly toward her. She barely managed to duck aside, her shoulder scraping painfully against the stone wall, adrenaline flooding her veins as the man reached for her again. Just as his fingers grazed her sleeve, a powerful force slammed into him from the side, sending him crashing hard against the opposite wall. Kale stood there suddenly, his eyes blazing gold, his chest heaving, with barely restrained fury. "Do not touch her," Kale growled, his voice carrying a rawness Elena had never heard from him before, something closer to the rough, unguarded voice of his wolf than his usual composed tone. The remaining attackers hesitated, clearly recognizing the danger radiating from him, before turning and fleeing back down the corridor with Dorian in pursuit. Kale turned to Elena immediately, his hands gently but urgently checking her for injuries, his composure cracked wide open by something far more instinctive than careful restraint. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice still rough, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm fine," Elena managed, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just frightened." Kale's jaw tightened, his hand lingering against her arm, a moment longer than necessary, before he seemed to catch himself, pulling back slightly, though his eyes remained fierce with protective anger. "This should never have happened inside these walls," he said. "I will not allow it to happen again." They moved quickly toward the safe chamber beneath the hall, Kale refusing to leave her side despite the chaos still unfolding above them. The chamber itself was small but secure, carved directly into the mountain stone, illuminated by a single lantern that cast long shadows across the walls. Elena sat on the narrow bench along one wall, still trembling slightly from the encounter, while Kale paced restlessly near the entrance, clearly torn between staying to guard her and returning to lead his pack against the remaining intruders. "Go," Elena said quietly. "Your people need you up there." "I cannot leave you unprotected," Kale said, his voice tight with conflict. "I'll be fine down here," Dorian said. "This chamber is secure." Kale hesitated, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her chest ache, with something she still did not fully understand. Finally he nodded, though reluctance colored every line of his expression. "I will return as soon as this is handled," he said. "Do not leave this chamber for any reason, no matter what you hear." He left quickly after that, and Elena remained alone in the dim lantern light, her mind racing through everything that had just happened. She understood now, with chilling clarity, that whatever reason had drawn Corwin's people into this conflict, she herself had become a direct target, not simply an unfortunate bystander caught in territorial disputes between rival packs. Time passed slowly in the small chamber, the muffled sounds of conflict above, gradually fading into an uneasy quiet. Elena's nerves remained taut throughout the waiting, jumping at every distant sound, until finally, the heavy door opened, and Kale stepped through, his shirt torn and marked with fresh scrapes, though relief flooded his expression the moment he saw her still safely seated where he had left her. "It's over," he said, moving quickly to kneel in front of her. "Corwin's people retreated once they realized their plan had failed. We lost no one, though several of my pack sustained injuries." "What did they want?" Elena asked, her voice steadier now, though the question had weighed on her throughout the tense waiting. Kale's expression darkened slightly. We captured one of them alive. He claims Corwin believes you carry knowledge, or perhaps power, tied to an old prophecy about bonds between humans and wolves. Whether that belief is true or not, Corwin clearly believes it enough to risk open conflict to obtain you. Elena absorbed this information slowly, her mind circling back to the strange ability she had discovered weeks earlier, the impossible way she could hear Cale's private thoughts belonging to something ancient and instinctive within him. She wondered, with a chill settling deep in her chest, whether this ability was somehow connected to whatever prophecy Corwin believed in. "I don't know anything about prophecies," she said honestly. "I don't understand any of this." "Neither do I, fully," Cale admitted, his hand reaching out hesitantly, before settling gently over hers. "But I intend to find out, and I intend to keep you safe throughout that process, no matter what it requires of me." His touch sent warmth spreading through her chest, and Elena found herself leaning slightly closer, drawn by an instinct she no longer wished to fight. Cale's eyes softened further, his usual careful distance entirely absent now, replaced by something raw and honest that mirrored everything his wolf had confessed in those quiet, unguarded moments she had overheard. "Cale," she began softly, wanting suddenly to tell him everything, to finally speak the truth about what she had been hearing all along. But before she could continue, shouting erupted from above once more, and Dorian's urgent voice called down through the chamber entrance, interrupting the fragile moment building between them. Cale's expression shifted instantly back into sharp focus, duty pulling him away, even as his eyes lingered on her with obvious reluctance. "We will finish this conversation," he said firmly, his hand squeezing hers gently, before he rose to leave. "I promise you that." Elena watched him go, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear for whatever new danger had arisen, and quiet anticipation for the conversation he had promised. Whatever shadows continued to circle this territory, whatever ancient prophecy Corwin believed connected her to this strange world, Elena understood now that she and Cale were bound together by something far stronger than mere circumstance, something that neither danger nor distance seemed able to fully sever. A week of uneasy calm settled over Blackthorn Hall following the failed attack, though the peace felt fragile, stretched thin over tension that refused to fully dissolve. Patrols doubled along every border, and Elena noticed the way pack members watched her now with a mixture of protectiveness and unspoken questions, aware that whatever Corwin wanted from her had nearly cost several lives. Cale had grown noticeably more attentive during those days, finding reasons to check on her throughout each afternoon, his careful distance replaced by something warmer, though he still had not returned to finish the conversation interrupted in the safe chamber. Elena found herself both grateful for his attention and increasingly anxious about the secret she continued to carry, the truth about the voice she could hear pressing heavier against her conscience with each passing day. It was during a quiet afternoon in the Eastern Gardens, the same path where they had walked together weeks earlier, that everything shifted violently once more. Elena had wandered slightly further than usual, drawn by a cluster of unfamiliar blue flowers near the garden's edge, when a hand suddenly clamped over her mouth from behind, dragging her backward into the tree line before she could even cry out. She struggled against the grip, adrenaline flooding her veins, managing to twist just enough to see two unfamiliar men pulling her deeper into the trees, their grip bruising against her arms. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, though instinct took over, and she drove her elbow sharply backward, connecting with enough force to loosen the hold just slightly. It was enough. She tore free and stumbled forward, screaming Cale's name with every ounce of breath she could manage, praying the sound would carry far enough to reach the hall. The men lunged after her, but before they could close the distance again, a powerful shape crashed through the underbrush. A massive wolf, with fur dark as midnight, eyes burning gold with unrestrained fury. Elena had never seen Cale in his wolf form before, had not even been certain what it might look like, but she recognized him instantly in the fierce protectiveness radiating from every powerful movement as he tore into the attackers with terrifying speed. She stumbled backward, watching in stunned silence as the conflict ended within moments, the wolf standing victorious over the fleeing remnants of the attack, chest heaving with barely contained rage. He shifted back to his human form moments later, breathing hard, his eyes immediately finding hers with an urgency that overrode any concern for his own state. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, his hands framing her face gently despite the intensity radiating from him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice rough, raw, with an emotion far too powerful to be simple duty. "I'm okay," Elena managed, though tears finally broke free, the adrenaline of the encounter catching up with her all at once. "Kale, I was so frightened." "I know," he said softly, pulling her gently against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a protectiveness that felt entirely different from anything careful or restrained. "I felt it the moment you screamed. I have never run so fast in my life." They remained like that for a long moment, Elena's trembling slowly easing beneath the steady warmth of his embrace, until finally, he pulled back just enough to look at her properly, his expression stripped of every careful wall he usually maintained. "I cannot lose you," he said quietly, the words escaping before he seemed to fully intend them. "I do not know when it happened, but somewhere between that first night in the forest and now, you became something I am not willing to imagine losing." Elena's heart pounded at the raw honesty in his voice, so different from his usual composed distance, so achingly familiar to the rough, unguarded voice she had heard whispering about her in private moments he never knew she witnessed. "Kale," she whispered, "there's something I need to tell you." His eyes searched hers, patient despite the tension still radiating from his body. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." She opened her mouth, the truth finally rising to the surface after weeks of careful silence. But before she could speak, Dorian's voice called urgently from the garden entrance, followed quickly by several pack members rushing toward them with clear alarm. "Alpha, we found tracks leading directly toward the northern ridge," Dorian said, breathless from running. "Corwin himself may be among those who attacked. We need to move quickly if we intend to catch them before they cross back into their own territory." Kale's expression tightened with visible frustration, torn between the urgency of the moment building between himself and Elena, and the responsibility weighing on him as Alpha. He turned back to her, his hand still resting gently against her cheek. "This is not finished," he said firmly. "I need you to trust me a little longer." "I trust you," Elena said softly, and she meant it completely, despite the truth still burning unspoken on her tongue. He pressed a brief, lingering kiss against her forehead, before turning to follow Dorian, his pack falling into formation around him with practiced efficiency. Elena watched him disappear through the garden gate, her heart still racing from everything that had just happened, the confession she had almost made hanging unfinished in the space between them. Lyra found her shortly after, having heard about the attack from the frantic whispers already spreading through the hall. She guided Elena back inside, insisting she rest despite Elena's protests that she felt fine, and sat with her quietly, while the hall buzzed with anxious activity surrounding the pursuit of Corwin's retreating forces. "You almost told him something," Lyra observed gently, noticing the distracted way Elena kept glancing toward the window. "I could see it in your face." Elena hesitated, weighing once more whether to finally share her secret with someone she trusted. "I've been hearing things," she admitted quietly. "Things Kale says, but not out loud. Things his wolf says, when he doesn't realize anyone else can hear." Lyra's eyes widened slightly, though surprise quickly shifted into quiet understanding. "That is not something that happens to humans," she said carefully. "Not unless there is a bond forming, something deeper than ordinary connection." Elena repeated, her pulse quickening. "It is rare," Lyra continued, "and old stories speak of it more than any living memory confirms, but sometimes, between fated pairs, a wolf's inner voice becomes audible to the one meant to walk beside them. If that is truly happening between you and Kale, it means far more than simple attraction." Elena absorbed this revelation slowly, pieces of the mystery finally beginning to align, the strange ability she had carried as a secret, suddenly carrying weight and meaning she had not previously understood. If Lyra was right, then the connection pulling her toward Kale was not some accident of fate, but something ancient and deliberate, something that explained both the strange voice she heard and the inexplicable danger Corwin seemed determined to exploit. Night fell before Kale returned from the pursuit, weary but unharmed, his expression carrying the exhaustion of a long chase that had ultimately failed to capture Corwin himself. He found Elena waiting near the hall's entrance, and though exhaustion weighed heavily on him, his eyes softened the moment he saw her. "We did not catch him," Kale admitted, frustration evident despite his fatigue, "but we drove his people far from our borders, at least for now." "I'm glad you're safe," Elena said softly, and this time, with the truth pressing so urgently against her chest, She knew she could not delay any longer. Kale, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you weeks ago. He studied her carefully, sensing the shift in her tone, the seriousness replacing the earlier softness. Tell me, he said gently. Elena took a steadying breath, gathering the courage that had eluded her for weeks, finally ready to speak the truth that had shaped every quiet moment between them since that very first night in the forest. I can hear your wolf, Elena said, the words spilling out before her courage could falter. Not always, but sometimes, when you speak to him, or he speaks to you, I hear it too. I've heard it since that very first week, when you didn't think anyone else was listening. Kale went completely still, his expression shifting through confusion, disbelief, and finally, something far more vulnerable, as understanding settled in. That is not possible, he said quietly, though there was no real denial in his tone, only stunned realization. No human has ever been able to hear a wolf's inner voice, unless... He stopped himself, and Elena watched the pieces click into place behind his eyes. The same realization Lyra had already suggested to her hours earlier. Unless there is a bond, she finished softly. Lyra told me the same thing. She said it only happens between fated pairs. Kale's throat worked as he swallowed, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. How long have you known? He asked, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. Since the night after our first real conversation, Elena admitted. I heard your wolf say I wasn't afraid of you, that everyone else in the hall feared what you were, but I hadn't. I thought I imagined it at first, but it kept happening, again and again, every time you thought you were alone. What else did you hear? He asked, and Elena could see the vulnerability behind the question. The fear that his most private thoughts he had never intended to share, had been laid bare before her without his knowledge. I heard him say I was stronger than I realized, she continued gently. I heard him ask you to tell me the truth about your feelings. I heard you both, the night you were wounded, talking about how you wanted to tell me what I meant to you, but didn't know how to explain something you barely understood yourself. Kale closed his eyes briefly, a mixture of embarrassment and something far softer crossing his features. I have spent years building walls around what I feel, he said quietly, learning to separate duty from desire, strength from vulnerability. And you have heard every crack in those walls since the very beginning. I should have told you sooner, Elena said, guilt creeping into her voice. I was afraid of how you might react, afraid this ability might make you see me as some kind of threat, or worse, an intrusion into something private that was never meant to be shared. I do not see you as a threat, Kale said firmly, stepping closer, his hand reaching to gently cup her face. I see you as someone who has known the truth of my heart longer than I had the courage to admit it myself. Elena's breath caught at the tenderness in his voice, so different from the composed distance he had maintained during their earliest encounters. Then you're not angry? She asked softly. How could I be angry? Kale said, when everything you heard was true. Every word my wolf spoke about you came from somewhere honest within me, somewhere I was too guarded to voice aloud until now. He paused, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek. Elena, from the very first night I found you in that forest, something inside me recognized you as more than a stranger passing through my territory. I did not understand it then. I am only beginning to understand it now. What does it mean? Elena asked. This bond, this connection between us. Lyra mentioned something about fated pairs, but I don't fully understand what that involves. Kale's expression grew thoughtful, though warmth remained steady beneath the seriousness of his tone. Among my people, it is said that some souls are bound to each other before they are even born, wolf and human alike, though such bonds are exceedingly rare in these modern times. When such a bond exists, the wolf recognizes its match instinctively, often before the human mind catches up to what the heart already knows. The ability to hear a wolf's inner voice is one of the clearest signs of such a bond, a sign I have only read about in old texts, never expected to witness myself. So this connection between us isn't ordinary, Elena said slowly, absorbing the weight of his explanation. No, Kale said softly. It is rare, and precious, and far more significant than either of us understood when you first stumbled into my forest 3 weeks ago. He hesitated, something vulnerable flickering behind his gold eyes. I do not know what this means for your future, whether you would even want to remain in a world so different from the one you knew before. But I know that whatever happens, whatever Corwin continues to threaten, I do not wish to face it without you standing beside me." Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though this time they carried none of the fear from earlier that day, only the overwhelming relief of finally speaking the truth after weeks of carrying it alone. "I don't want to leave," she said softly. "Even with everything strange and dangerous about this place, I have never felt as certain about anything as I feel about wanting to stay here, with you." Cale's expression softened completely then, every remaining trace of his careful composure dissolving into something open and unguarded, matching exactly the honest warmth Elena had heard from his wolf all along. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she chose, though she remained perfectly still, allowing him to close the distance until his lips met hers gently, the kiss carrying every unspoken word that had passed quietly between them for weeks. When they finally parted, Cale rested his forehead gently against hers, his breathing unsteady with emotion he no longer attempted to hide. "I have never allowed myself to want something this deeply," he admitted quietly. "Not since I became Alpha, but you have changed something in me, Elena, something I do not intend to fight any longer." "Neither do I," Elena whispered, her hand resting against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. They remained together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the weight of weeks of secrecy finally lifted between them, replaced by an honesty that felt both freeing and slightly overwhelming, given everything else still threatening the fragile peace of Blackthorn territory. Eventually, Dorian's voice called softly from down the corridor, reminding Cale of council matters still requiring his attention despite the late hour, and the moment gently drew to a close. Before he left, Cale pressed one more soft kiss against her forehead, his eyes lingering on hers with a warmth that promised far more conversations to come. "Rest well tonight, Elena," he said gently. "Tomorrow, we begin figuring out what this bond truly means. Together, without any more secrets standing between us." Elena watched him go, her heart lighter than it had felt in weeks, the confession finally spoken aloud, settling into something steady and reassuring, rather than fearful. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever threat Corwin continued to pose against Blackthorn territory, she understood now that she would face them, not as an outsider, caught in circumstances beyond her control, but as someone bound by fate itself, to the Alpha King, standing at the center of it all. A messenger arrived just after sunrise, breathless and pale, dropping to one knee before Cale, with a scroll clutched tightly in his shaking hand. Elena watched from across the hall as Cale's expression darkened while reading its contents, the easy warmth from the previous night, replaced instantly by sharp, controlled fury. "Corwin demands a formal meeting," Cale said, passing the scroll to Dorian, who read it quickly, his jaw tightening with each line. "He claims to have proof of the bond between Elena and myself, and threatens to expose it to every pack in the region, unless we surrender her into his custody." "He would use our bond against us," Elena said, disbelief mixing with growing anger. How could he possibly benefit from exposing something like that? "Old alliances," Dorian said grimly. "If word spreads that a human shares a fated bond with the Alpha of Blackthorn, other packs may see it as weakness, or worse, as an opportunity to challenge your authority directly, Alpha. Corwin intends to use this knowledge as leverage, either to force your surrender of Elena, or to destabilize your rule entirely." Cale's hands clenched at his sides, though his voice remained carefully measured when he spoke again. "Then we will not give him the chance to use it against us. Gather the council. If Corwin intends to expose this bond as a weapon, I would rather the pack hear the truth from me directly, on my own terms, than through the twisted words of an enemy." The council gathered within the hour, elders and senior pack members filling the great hall with an atmosphere thick with tension and curiosity. Elena stood beside Cale at the front of the hall, her nerves stretched thin despite the steady reassurance of his hand resting gently at the small of her back. Cale addressed the gathered pack with the same commanding presence Elena had witnessed since their very first meeting in the forest, though now his words carried a vulnerability she had never seen him show publicly before. He spoke of the night he found her running through Blackthorn territory, of the strange, undeniable pull he had felt from that very first moment, and finally, of the rare bond that had revealed itself between them, a bond confirmed by Elena's own ability to hear thoughts no ordinary human should ever perceive. Murmurs rippled through the hall as he spoke, some pack members exchanging uncertain glances, others nodding slowly, as if pieces of a larger puzzle were finally settling into place. An elder woman near the front, her silver hair pulled back in a tight braid, rose slowly to her feet once Kale finished speaking. "Fated bonds have not been witnessed among our people in generations," she said, her voice carrying the weight of long years and deep wisdom. "If what you say is true, Alpha, this is no weakness to be exploited. It is a blessing, one that speaks to the strength and continuation of our bloodline, regardless of the human blood it carries." Relief washed through Elena at the elder's words, though tension remained thick throughout the hall as other voices rose in question and cautious debate. Kale answered each concern patiently, his composure steady despite the weight of scrutiny settling over him and Elena both. Slowly, gradually, the mood within the hall began to shift, uncertainty giving way to a hesitant but growing acceptance among the gathered pack. By the time the council meeting concluded, word had already begun spreading through Blackthorn Hall, and Elena noticed a marked change in the way pack members regarded her throughout the following days. Wary glances softened into curious respect, whispered questions transformed into genuine welcome, and Lyra, practically glowing with excitement, insisted on celebrating properly despite the looming threat still hanging over their territory. "This is exactly what the old stories promised," Lyra said one evening, helping Elena arrange fresh flowers throughout her chamber, a small gesture of celebration from the pack women, who had begun visiting more frequently since the revelation. "A bond strong enough to be heard, strong enough to withstand even Corwin's attempts to weaponize it. It is rare, and it is wonderful." Elena smiled, though worry still lingered beneath her happiness. "Corwin hasn't given up," she reminded Lyra gently. "He wanted to use this bond as leverage, and now that his plan has failed, I worry about what he might attempt next." "Kale will not let anything happen to you," Lyra said firmly. "Especially not now, with the entire pack standing behind your bond rather than questioning it." That evening, Kale found Elena in the Eastern Gardens, the same path where danger had struck weeks earlier, though tonight, the atmosphere carried none of that earlier fear, only the soft glow of lanterns, strung carefully between the trees, a quiet celebration, organized by pack members, eager to honor the rare bond now confirmed among them. "You did this?" Elena asked, taking in the gentle beauty of the illuminated garden, flowers blooming beneath soft golden light. "The pack did this," Kale corrected gently, though his eyes carried unmistakable warmth as he watched her reaction. "They wanted to celebrate properly, now that the truth has been spoken openly rather than hidden away as something to fear." They walked slowly through the garden together, pack members offering quiet nods of respect as they passed, a stark contrast to the wary glances Elena had grown accustomed to during her earliest days within these walls. Kale eventually led her toward a quiet alcove near the garden's center, away from the gathered celebration, where he turned to face her with unusual solemnity. "I want to ask you something," he said softly, "though I understand if the answer requires more time than either of us has had to properly consider it." "What is it?" Elena asked, her heart quickening at the seriousness in his tone. "Bonds such as ours are rarely left unspoken for long, once discovered," Kale explained carefully. "Traditionally, they are honored through a formal claiming, a ceremony recognized by the entire pack, joining human and wolf, mate and alpha, into something permanent and unbreakable." He paused, searching her eyes carefully. "I do not wish to rush you into something so significant, especially given everything else threatening our peace right now, but I want you to know that when you are ready, I intend to claim you properly, before this entire pack and beyond, as my mate and future queen." Elena's breath caught at the weight and sincerity behind his words, every lingering doubt about her place within this strange new world dissolving beneath the certainty in his gold eyes. "I don't need more time," she said softly. "I have known what I feel for weeks now, even before I found the courage to admit it. I want that bond, Kale. I want to stand beside you, properly, as your mate." Something fierce and joyful ignited behind his eyes at her words, and he pulled her gently into his arms, pressing a lingering kiss against her temple, before resting his forehead against hers. "Then once Corwin's threat has been fully dealt with, we will honor this bond exactly as it deserves," he promised quietly. "Before the whole of Blackthorn, and before whatever future awaits us both." They remained together in that quiet alcove for a long while, the distant sounds of celebration drifting softly through the garden air. Two hearts finally united openly, after weeks of hidden longing and careful secrecy. Yet even amid the warmth of that moment, Elena could not fully shake the uneasy awareness that Corwin's threat still loomed somewhere beyond Blackthorn's borders, patient and calculating, waiting for the next opportunity to strike against the bond he had failed to weaponize. Horns blasted across Blackthorn territory just before dawn, the deep, urgent sound ripping Elena from sleep with instant, bone-deep dread. She was on her feet, before she fully registered moving, throwing open her chamber door, just as Lyra rushed down the corridor toward her, face pale with alarm. "Corwin's forces are moving on the main gate," Lyra said breathlessly. "This isn't a raid, it's a full assault. He must have gathered every ally he could convince to join him." Elena's stomach dropped as she followed Lyra quickly through the corridors, the entire hall alive with urgent motion, warriors pulling on armor, orders being shouted across every corridor they passed. She found Cale in the war room, already dressed for battle, his expression carved from grim determination, as he studied a map spread across the table with Dorian and several senior pack members. "How many?" Cale demanded, as another scout burst into the room. "At least 50, Alpha. Possibly more approaching from the northern tree line as well," the scout reported, chest heaving from his run. "Corwin leads them himself." Cale's jaw tightened, though his composure remained steady despite the severity of the news. "He grows desperate," he said quietly. "A direct assault means he has run out of subtler options. We hold the gate, and we hold the eastern wall. I want archers positioned along the battlements immediately." The room emptied quickly, as orders were relayed throughout the hall, until only Elena remained standing near the doorway, watching Cale prepare for what could easily become the most dangerous conflict Blackthorn had faced in years. He turned to her once the room cleared, his expression softening slightly despite the urgency of the moment. "You need to go to the safe chamber," he said, closing the distance between them, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "I cannot fight properly, if I am worried about your safety above the walls." "I understand," Elena said, though fear for his safety clawed at her chest. "Please be careful, Cale. I intend to return to you," he said firmly, "and I intend to keep the promise I made in that garden. This is not the day our bond ends, Elena. This is simply one more obstacle standing between us and the future we have chosen together." He kissed her once, brief but filled with promise, before turning to join his gathering warriors, leaving Elena to be escorted quickly toward the safe chamber beneath the hall by two younger pack members assigned specifically to her protection. The heavy door closed behind her, muffling the growing chaos above, though the distant sounds of shouting and clashing steel still managed to reach her even through solid stone. Time crawled unbearably slow within the chamber, Elena pacing restlessly, while the two guards remained stationed near the entrance, tense and alert to any sign of danger reaching this deep beneath the hall. She strained to hear anything beyond the muffled chaos, desperate for some indication of how the battle above was unfolding, praying silently that Cale remained safe amid whatever violence continued to rage. Hours passed before the sounds above finally began to quiet, the distant chaos gradually settling into an uneasy stillness that felt almost more unsettling than the earlier noise had been. Elena's heart pounded with uncertainty, until finally, footsteps approached the chamber door, and Dorian's voice called through, requesting entry. He looked exhausted, blood staining one sleeve, though his expression carried something closer to relief than despair. "It's over," he said simply. "Corwin's forces have been driven back completely. Several of his closest allies were captured, and Corwin himself was forced to retreat with what remained of his strength." "And Cal?" Elena asked immediately, her voice tight with worry. "He is well," Dorian assured her, a faint smile finally breaking through his exhaustion. "Tired, and carrying a few injuries of his own, but very much alive, and asking for you, the moment the fighting ended." Relief flooded through Elena so completely that her knees nearly buckled, and she followed Dorian quickly back up through the hall, weaving past pack members tending to injuries, and beginning the slow process of clearing away the damage from the assault. She found Cale near the main courtyard, a bandage wrapped around his forearm, his expression exhausted but unmistakably triumphant when his eyes finally found hers. She crossed the distance between them without hesitation, and he pulled her into his arms despite the surrounding pack members, holding her close with a relief that mirrored her own. I told you I would return, he murmured against her hair. You did, Elena said softly, tears of relief finally slipping free. I was so afraid. It is over now, Cale said gently, pulling back just enough to look at her properly. Corwin has lost the strength to threaten us again anytime soon, and the pack stands stronger than ever, united behind the bond we share, rather than divided by fear of it. In the weeks that followed, Blackthorn territory slowly returned to peaceful rhythm, injuries healing, patrols easing back into their normal routines, the memory of Corwin's failed assault fading into cautious relief rather than lingering dread. Cale kept his promise, and preparations began quickly for the formal claiming ceremony that would bind Elena to him completely, in the eyes of the entire pack. The day of the ceremony arrived beneath clear skies, Blackthorn Hall decorated with flowers and soft golden light, pack members gathering from every corner of the territory to witness the rare and precious bond finally honored properly. Elena stood at the center of the great hall, dressed in flowing fabric the color of moonlight, her heart steady, despite the weight of every eye upon her. Cale approached slowly, dressed in formal attire that still carried the quiet strength she had come to know so intimately, his gold eyes shining with open, unguarded warmth as he took her hands in his before the gathered pack. The elder woman who had first spoken in favor of their bond stood beside them, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall as she recited the ancient words meant to seal such a union. Cale spoke his vows steadily, his voice carrying the same honesty Elena had first heard from his wolf weeks earlier, in private, unguarded moments, promising loyalty, protection, and love that would endure beyond any threat or challenge. Elena spoke her own vows in turn, her voice steady with certainty she had never expected to feel so completely, promising her heart fully to the Alpha King who had once been nothing more than a mysterious guarded stranger in a dark forest. When the ceremony concluded, Cale pulled her gently into a kiss before the entire pack, and the hall erupted into joyful celebration, cheers and applause echoing off the ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of Blackthorn history. Elena laughed through happy tears, wrapped securely in Cale's arms, finally and completely bound to the man whose private, honest voice she had once heard by secret accident, a voice that had revealed the truth of his heart long before he ever found the courage to speak it aloud himself. That night, standing together on the balcony, overlooking the moonlit forest where their story had first begun, Cale pulled Elena close against his chest, his lips brushing softly against her temple. I never imagined, he murmured quietly, that the woman who once ran through my territory in fear would become the queen who now stands so completely undaunted beside me. I never imagined a king could hide such warmth beneath so much careful distance, Elena replied softly, smiling up at him. I'm glad I heard the truth, even if I wasn't supposed to. Cale's answering smile was warm and unguarded, entirely his own now, spoken freely, rather than hidden away in private, whispered conversations with a wolf who had known the truth all along. It was always meant to be heard, he said gently. Some secrets, it seems, are simply too honest to stay hidden forever. They remained together beneath the quiet moonlight, the forest stretching peacefully below them. The kingdom finally settled into a future built on truth rather than secrecy, on love spoken openly rather than whispered only in private, unguarded moments between a king and the wolf who had loved her first.